What are Vivek Ramaswamy's views on education? In this video, I'm going to talk about that as well as give some of my own thoughts on the subject of education. Recently, I uploaded a video on Vivek Ramaswamy. I'll link that video below. It actually, by my channel's standards, it did very well. I got a lot of views, a lot of likes on that video, a lot of engagement, and a bunch of new subscribers. So first of all, if that's you and you recently subscribed after viewing my Vivek video, welcome aboard. Vivek isn't the only thing I talk about here, so hopefully you'll find some of my other content interesting as well. But I got a ton of comments on that video, and most of them were really supportive of Vivek. A lot of people seem to like him, at least online. He seems to be trending fairly well. And a lot of people have a very positive view of Vivek. He seems promising to them, as he does to me. I try to maintain a healthy skepticism of any public figure, even the ones that I like, because politicians often say one thing, they say a lot of things that sound really nice and good, and then they get elected and do something else. So after decades of observing politics, I've learned to maintain a healthy skepticism of everybody involved. But on the face of it, there's a lot of things that I like about Vivek. While most of the comments were supportive of Vivek, I did have some detractors, some people that disagree with Vivek on various things. And disagreement is always welcome on my channel. If I say something that you think is wrong, by all means, correct me in the comments section. If you've got a different perspective on things, by all means, share it with me. And that's sort of my catalyst for this video. So my last Vivek video, a user by the name of Raul writes, he wants to privatize public schools for him and his healthy friends to profit from the children's education. Now, obviously, I don't think that's true, but to be honest, I'm not an expert on Vivek's policies or stated policies towards education. I know that he's come out and said that he wants to get rid of the federal Department of Education, which on the face of it, I'm sympathetic to because, in my view, it's kind of redundant. Each state already has their own Department of Education. I also don't like the culture and tone in Washington. I don't want the feds having control over, or much control over, the education system in the country. I believe that control rightly belongs in the hands of parents and should be handled more at the local and state level. So getting rid of the federal Department of Education is a cause that I'm sympathetic towards. And as a libertarian-minded person, I'm fairly well versed on libertarian attitudes towards education, what sort of reforms libertarians tend to support. I think philosophically Vivek is a very libertarian-minded person. So I feel like I had a hunch as to what his philosophy would be towards education. But to be honest, I haven't really dug into it and looked at his specific platform, at least when it comes to education. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to sort of look into what his stated platform is towards education. First, we'll look at what is Vivek's actual stated position on the topic, and then I'll do my analysis and put my 2 cents in. So if you go to Vivek's campaign website, right on the front page, section 4, there's a section titled Dismantle Managerial Bureaucracy. And the very first item is shut down toxic government agencies. He has listed there the Department of Education, FBI, IRS, and more. And it says rebuild from scratch when required. So that's right from the campaign site. He wants to shut down the Department of Education. Now, when he's talked to this issue in interviews, basically he said for the most part, he thinks the agency is toxic. It uses federal funding and the threat of withholding federal funding to sort of bully school districts around the country into adopting the policies that the federal Department of Education wants them to adopt. And of course, that's stealing control from the parents in those communities that maybe don't want radical gender ideology or radical race ideology creeping into the curriculum. They want their kids to go to school to learn how to do math and read, have a basic understanding of history and civics, to come out of the system with the capacity to be critical thinkers and be able to research and make up their own mind on things. They don't want their schools to be little ideological indoctrination camps. At least if I was a parent, that's what I would want from my school system. If I have kids someday and I send them through 12 years of schooling and they don't come out on the other side with the capacity to think for themselves, I would feel like I have wasted my children's time by sending them off to the government schools. To get it straight from the horse's mouth, I'll splice in a clip of Vivek putting it in his own words. The following comes from an interview he did on Fox Business.
You talk education a lot. We're talking trade work and trade school right now. Is that part of what you've got baked into your plan if you become president and talk about reforming education in America?
Absolutely. I'm actually talking to you from a factory in Central Ohio where I just gave a speech about this very issue. We have a shortage of skilled workers and workers who have been trained in areas where we have workforce deficiencies. One of the top obstacles for many businesses to grow is to find actual employees with the right skill sets to fill those open positions. And part of the reason is that the U.S. Department of Education has spent $80 billion of taxpayer money on, among other things, subsidizing four-year college degrees without doing a thing for people going to trade schools or to get vocational education. The good news is we don't have to just complain about that. We can change that. So I've said that we would shut down the U.S. Department of Education, but move vocational training and other programs in this country to the Department of Labor. Those are the kinds of sensible solutions that we're going to need. And there are people for whom a four-year college degree may be the right choice, and that's great. They should go for it. The other thing I would say about the trades, though, is there may be people who pursue four-year college degrees that still have a component of vocational or trade education that's even built into four-year college degree programs that are now missing it. But the fact of the matter is that kind of diversity is going to be a good thing. It doesn't have to be either or. We can actually look at models where it's an and, where people who go to trade schools can learn a little bit about liberal arts or vice versa. I think that's the way the future is going.
Vivek, I want to ask you about China. So many are concerned that, they're literally eating our lunch when it comes to education and so many other things. When you look at the stats, the story is pretty much there. They're first when it comes to reading and math. And we are 13th in reading and 36th in math. How do we get our kids' scores up? How do we get them more competitive on the global stage? How would you do it?
The first thing is the simplest. We have to acknowledge that the purpose of our educational system is to advance the achievement of our students. And the fact that that's controversial to say that's the sole purpose shows you what the real problem is. So what I would do is first go to school choice on steroids. Kids should not be trapped in the zip code that they're born in. Parents should be able to send their kids to the best possible schools. That holds public schools, including in poorer areas, to higher standards than they're being held today. I also think, and I know this is controversial, but I think we have to get rid of teachers' unions in this country that have perverted our educational system to being about the employment opportunities for teachers' union bureaucrats rather than being about our actual children. And then they blow woke smoke to make up for it, saying that 2 + 2 = 4. Math is racist. That's something you started to hear last year. Well, math is not racist, but what might be wrong and inequitable is failing to teach kids in cities across this country how to do math. This is personal to me because education was my ticket to get ahead. I'm the kid of immigrants who came to this country with no money. I've gone on to found multi-billion-dollar companies. I want every kid in this country to have access to that same opportunity.
Vivek, you mentioned just a moment ago your proposal to shut down the Department of Education. I want to ask you about that a little bit. On your campaign's website, you have an infographic which is helpful to understand what your plan would be. And if we can pull that up, we can show everyone that your plan is essentially to, move a lot of the responsibilities that currently fall under the Department of Education to other departments, Department of Labor, Department of State. Student loans, for example, will go over to the Department of Treasury. Vivek, I wonder, though, for folks that really want to see Department of Education eliminated, they might look at this plan and say, this is kind of just reshuffling the bureaucratic chairs on the deck, so to speak. Is this plan really going far enough? What do you say to people that might have that concern?
It's absolutely. So I would say the converse. You've heard a lot of people give you a lot of fancy talk about shutting down the Department of Education in the past. The reason it hasn't happened is there wasn't a pragmatic plan to actually execute it. So what I've laid out is something that we will get done in my first year in office. By the end of 2025, the U.S. Department of Education won't exist. But part of the problem is that department, that bureaucracy has become a cultural rot, telling local schools across this country that You can't get that money from the federal government unless you adopt toxic racial and gender ideologies. That's part of the culture of the Department of Education, which is why we can't just reform it, as Trump tried to do with Betsy DeVos, a good person. We have to get in there and shut it down, but I'm very practical about it to make sure that it's going to be seamless relative to the status quo for people across this country. Much of that money that you see going to the states in that plan is going to end up in the hands of parents that are actually able to use that money to send their kids to the best possible schools. In any state that has school choice programs, that's going to be a condition for giving that money back to the states.
Vivek,
so this is a radical quantum leap, and I think it's actually going to drive the change that we've been waiting for a long time in this country.
I want to drill on that a little bit because there's a lot of parents who feel like they've gotten kicked out of the driver's seat. You know, they have primary responsibility for their kids' education, and you've got schools now who refuse to tell them what's going on in their child's life. How do you fix that? Is there anything you can do at the federal level to put parents back in the driver's seat and feel like they've got some control again?
The first thing I will say is I am a 10th Amendment absolutist. A lot of this will have to be driven by the local level, by states, even New Hampshire, where I'm spending a lot of time recently. It's a Republican-controlled legislature and governorship. And yet it failed to pass a bill that just said you as a parent have the right to know if your own kid is identifying as a gender different from their biological sex in school. I think that's senseless. Parents deserve transparency. Parents need to determine the education of their children. My view is if you're going to teach it in the classroom, you better put it on the internet. If you don't want to put it on the internet, then you probably shouldn't be teaching it in the classroom. Radical choice, radical transparency, but there's a role for everyone to play, both at the federal and state level. My job from the federal government is making sure that the federal government isn't quietly creating some of these problems as they are today through the U.S. Department of Education that uses grants to local schools as a cudgel to create a lot of those anti-parent policies.
Also from Vivek's public statements, he's very much pro-school choice. Philosophically, I believe in school choice as well. I think there's definitely a place for public funding of education, but I think parents and students should have a lot more choice as to where that funding goes. As in, they should be able to choose from a variety of different schools in their community. And rather than the funding being tied to a specific school, the funding should follow the students. If the state's going to fund education at $10,000 per pupil per year or whatever the amount happens to be, that money should follow the student. And if they choose to go to this school, well then that funding goes to that school, or whatever the case may be, whatever school they choose to go to, the funding should follow the student. That's what I mean when I talk about school choice, and I think that's what most libertarian advocates of school choice would agree with. And the reason you want that is because it leads to competition in the marketplace. Right now, K through 12 is essentially a monopoly in a lot of areas, especially areas that don't have any school choice. You might be tempted to say, well, there is private schools, but the problem with that is if you're not at the very least middle class or upper middle class or wealthy, you can't afford to send your kids to private school because basically you already have to pay property taxes, and the majority of your property taxes goes to funding the public schools. So if you want to send your kid to a private school on top of that, you got to pay your property tax bill to fund the public schools, and then you also have to pay tuition to send your kid to a private school. And the rich and powerful have no problem doing that. They can send their kids to the best schools, and they can make sure their kids are networking with other children of rich and powerful people. Well, the rest of the population, those of us that can't afford to fund the public school system and pay for private tuition, most of our kids get funneled into the public schools. For example, Barack Obama, who's rich and powerful, and when he was in power, his administration was very much opposed to the idea of school choice, yet because he has money, he was able to send his kids to elite private schools. I guess the hypocrisy of rich, powerful Democrats knows no bounds. Now, one might ask the question, why do Democrats usually oppose school choice programs? And I think the answer is actually pretty simple. All you got to do is follow the money. The educators' unions are extremely powerful. The unions that teachers are in extremely deep pockets and a lot of influence. And they lobby the shit out of Democrat politicians. And their interest is to maintain the status quo. The public teachers unions overwhelmingly oppose school choice because that competition threatens their monopoly. They want to maintain that monopoly. They don't want other producers of education to get into the market and steal their market share. These teachers unions, like I said, they've got deep pockets. They're very well organized, and their support almost exclusively is behind Democrats. So Democrats are beholden to what the teachers unions want. And not surprisingly, people like Vivek, or generally people who want more school choice, are critical of teachers unions because they're the main obstacle to getting more vibrancy, more innovation into the market of education. And a lot of times, especially teachers want to pretend that education isn't a business like any other business. But it is. They're providing a service. In this case, educating children. And like I said, in the K through 12 system, the unions have a virtual monopoly over the system. Unless you're rich enough to be able to afford to send your kids to a private school, you really don't have much choice. And just like in any other sector of the economy, if there isn't a healthy competition, two things are going to happen. A, you're not going to have pressure on controlling cost. Schools don't have to figure out how to get more efficient because they're the only game in town, and as long as they elect politicians that want to throw more money at them, there really isn't a big incentive to have to get more efficient and control cost. And B, they don't have to maintain quality. Because what are you going to do? It's not like the school in the district that you live in is shitty. It's not like you have a lot of choices. Maybe if you're lucky, you can cart your kid over to a better district, but that's certainly not going to be convenient for you. In any other sector of the economy where there is healthy competition, if there's several major players all producing the same thing and they're in competition with one another, well, they got to figure out how to make their product cheaper, and or they have to improve quality. They have to get consumers to choose their product over the next guy's. Think about the car industry, for example. If you compare cars today against cars produced 50 or 60 years ago, well, the older cars, they have a lot of nostalgic value. They're collectible items. The newer cars are actually light years ahead of the older cars in terms of quality. The older cars, you get flat tires all the time. If you went on a trip and drove it for any length of time, you inevitably had to do tune-ups to keep the thing running smoothly. Cars might not be a lot cheaper than they were in the past, but they're definitely, in terms of quality and innovation, they're light years ahead of their predecessors. Think of fuel economy. A Honda Civic will get almost 40 miles per gallon. What did a car in the 1960s get? A Toyota, you might be able to get 300,000 miles out of it before you have to replace it with a minimal amount of maintenance. If you did that with an older car, you would spend a fortune replacing parts to get anywhere near that sort of longevity out of it. Say the same thing with computers. Imagine you had $2,000 to spend on a computer in 1970. Think of what that would get you. And nowadays, everybody walks around with a computer in their pocket, the smartphone. Not only can you get a really, really nice smartphone for under $2,000, it's actually exponentially more powerful than what you would get in the year 1970 if you had $2,000 to spend on a computer. Now, why was there so much innovation? It's because there's multiple people producing these things. There's multiple American makers of automobiles, and they also have to compete with foreign competitors that also want to sell in our market. Same thing with computers. There's multiple producers of these things, and they have to figure out how to get more efficient and how to make better and better products because they have to compete with one another. Now, contrast that with K through 12 education, where the teachers' unions have a virtual monopoly on the system, and they don't want to allow in competitors because they don't want to compete with them. They'd be perfectly content with a system where everyone has basically one option. You live in this district, you got to send your kid to that school. Unless, of course, you're a rich, powerful Democrat, and in that case, you can afford to send your kid to an elite private school where they'll get a top-tier education. So that's the basic argument for school choice programs. And I think a lot of good would come from more competition in K through 12 education. I would like to add there is an often overlooked aspect to this, and I don't think I've heard Vivek address this directly, although I will say that the values he espouses would address this problem. He talks about individuals, families, nation, and God. Those foundational values. To build stronger families, we need stronger individuals. Strong, responsible individuals tend to build strong families. Strong families build strong communities. Collections of strong communities build strong nations. Of course, God doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, but I will say everybody serves a God whether they know it or not. What you put up there as your highest value, your guiding star. And I don't just mean what you pay lip service to, but what your actions reveal about what you serve as your highest good. That has incredible influence over the trajectory of your life. So you might want to put some thought into what ultimately you serve. What is your highest good? And while I think in communities where education is really struggling, having more school choice would help, and it would help a great deal. Although, like so many other problems in the world, the root cause is poor parenting in those communities. Because regardless of what sort of education system we have, ultimately the responsibility for a child's education lies at the feet of the parents. And in your communities with strong conservative values, where people tend to marry their baby mamas, for lack of a better term, and invest heavily in the development of their children, making sure that they're getting a good education and engaging in healthy activities. In those communities, almost any education system would do okay. In communities where you don't have that, in communities, let's say, where there's a 90% out of wedlock birth rate, where fathers don't stick around, and where the mothers often have serious deficits as well in the parenting department, areas like that, education is going to struggle no matter what sort of system you have, and no matter how much public money you throw at it. Money is not the root cause of the problem. Just throwing money at a problem has diminishing returns. There's only so much per pupil spending that does any good, and after a certain point, you're just flushing money down the toilet. Public spending on education is no substitute for parental involvement. Sound parenting. So that's my 2 cents on education in America, but give me your 2 cents in the comments below. You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.